You're standing in the heart of Rome. The year is 68 ID, and you're witnessing something that will make your blood freeze in your veins. Through the marble corridors of the Imperial Palace walks a figure draped in silk and jewels, moving with the practiced grace of a Roman empress. The courtiers bow deeply as this person passes, their eyes carefully averted, their faces masks of forced composure. But you know the horrifying truth that everyone else is desperately trying to ignore. That elegant figure beside the most powerful man on earth was born a boy named Sporus, and what Emperor Nero did to him represents one of the most twisted acts of psychological manipulation and physical mutilation in all of human history. This isn't just another story about Roman decadence or imperial excess. This is the tale of how absolute power can transform grief into madness, love into obsession, and a human being into a living monument to one man's complete break from reality. The story begins with Nero himself, a man who didn't start as a monster. When he first ascended to the throne at just 16 years old, Romans actually celebrated. Here was a young emperor who reduced taxes, funded magnificent public games, and even performed in theaters for the entertainment of common citizens. He seemed to represent a new golden age for the empire. But power has a way of revealing what lurks beneath the surface of seemingly decent people, and in Nero's case, what emerged was something that would horrify even a civilization accustomed to brutality. By the year 65 AD, something fundamental had shattered inside the emperor's mind. Perhaps it was the crushing isolation of being the only person in an empire of 60 million who could never be contradicted or challenged. Maybe it was the paranoia that comes with knowing that everyone around you either wants your position or lives in terror of your whims. Or perhaps it was what happened to the one person he claimed to love above all others, a woman whose death would send him spiraling into a madness so complete that it would reshape the very definition of imperial cruelty. Her name was Poppaea Sabina, and she was everything Nero believed he wanted in a woman. Beautiful beyond description, intelligent enough to match wits with the emperor himself, and ambitious enough to share his grandiose dreams of eternal glory. But Poppaea wasn't just another pretty face decorating the imperial court. She possessed razor-sharp political instincts that made her either a formidable ally or a deadly enemy, depending on which side of her favor you found yourself. When Nero first encountered Poppaea, he was already married to Octavia, daughter of the previous emperor. It had been a cold, calculated political union, devoid of genuine affection. Poppaea represented everything that Octavia was not. Where Octavia was quiet and reserved, Poppaea commanded attention wherever she went. Where Octavia preferred to remain in the background, Poppaea thrived on being the center of everyone's gaze. She was fire where Octavia was ice, passion where there had been only duty. What began as a typical Roman affair quickly evolved into something far more dangerous. Nero wasn't simply attracted to Poppaea's beauty or charmed by her wit. He became consumed by her in a way that terrified even his closest advisors. Ancient historians describe his behavior during this period as increasingly erratic and possessive. He would fly into murderous rages if other men so much as glanced at Poppaea during public functions. He stationed guards around her constantly, officially for her protection, but really to monitor her every interaction with others. The emperor lavished gifts upon her that drained the imperial treasury. Jewels from the farthest reaches of India, silks from distant China, perfumes from Arabia that cost more than most Romans would see in a lifetime. But perhaps most telling was how Nero began reshaping reality itself to accommodate his obsession. He shocked the Roman establishment by divorcing Octavia, a move that alienated many of his supporters. Then he announced his intention to marry Poppaea in a ceremony of unprecedented luxury and grandeur. The wedding was a spectacle that bankrupted provinces, with Nero sparing no expense to demonstrate the depth of his devotion. But even marriage couldn't satisfy his need to possess Poppaea completely. He began isolating her from family and friends, surrounding her only with people who owed their positions entirely to his favor. He commissioned dozens of portraits and sculptures of her, not just for public display, but for his private chambers, so he could gaze upon her image, even during their brief separations. Ancient sources tell us that Nero would sometimes spend hours simply watching Poppaea go about her daily activities. This wasn't romantic devotion. This was the behavior of someone who had confused love with ownership, who saw another human being not as an independent person, but as a beautiful object created solely for his pleasure and entertainment. Poppaea, for her part, seemed to understand the dangerous game she was playing. She was intelligent enough to recognize that her beauty and Nero's obsession gave her unprecedented power, but shrewd enough to realize that this power came with enormous risks. She began using her influence to advance her family's interests and build networks of supporters who might protect her if the emperor's affections ever shifted. But Poppaea possessed one fatal flaw that would ultimately seal her doom. Unlike everyone else in the imperial court, who had learned to anticipate Nero's moods and defer to his every whim, she retained her independence of spirit. She would argue with him about policy decisions, criticize his artistic pursuits, and even mock his theatrical performances when she found them lacking. In a world where the emperor's word was literally law, Poppaea dared to treat him like an ordinary husband who could be challenged and corrected. The details of what happened on that fateful day in 65 AD vary, depending on which ancient historian you consult, but the outcome remains consistent across all accounts. During what started as a typical domestic argument, some sources say about Nero returning late from chariot races, others about his endless theatrical pursuits. The emperor lost control in a way that would haunt him for the rest of his days. According to the historian Tacitus, the argument escalated when Poppaea dared to criticize Nero's priorities, suggesting that he cared more about his public image than his responsibilities as a husband and father. She was pregnant at the time, carrying what would have been their second child, and perhaps the stress of her condition made her less willing to tolerate his increasingly erratic behavior. What happened next has been debated by scholars for nearly 2,000 years, but the consensus among ancient sources is clear. Nero, in a fit of uncontrolled rage, either kicked or struck his pregnant wife with such brutal force that she suffered fatal internal injuries. Some accounts describe a single devastating blow to her abdomen. Others paint a picture of a sustained attack that left her bleeding and unconscious on the marble floor of their palace. Imagine the moment when Nero realized what he had done. Here was a man who commanded 30 legions, who could order the execution of anyone in the empire with a simple word, who was worshipped as a living god in the eastern provinces. Yet he had just destroyed the one thing he actually cared about. The woman he had obsessed over, the person he claimed to love more than life itself, was dying because of his own uncontrolled violence. The scene that followed was described by ancient sources as one of the most pathetic spectacles in imperial history. Nero reportedly threw himself upon Poppaea's dying body, alternately begging her forgiveness and commanding her to live, as if his imperial authority somehow extended even over death itself. He summoned the finest physicians in Rome, offering them unimaginable fortunes to save her life, while simultaneously threatening them with torture and death if they failed. But it was already too late. Poppaea died within hours, taking with her the unborn child who might have secured Nero's dynasty. In that moment, something fundamental broke inside the emperor's mind. What followed wasn't simply grief or remorse. It was a complete psychological collapse that would reshape the very nature of imperial madness. Nero's mourning became the stuff of legend, but not in any way it inspired admiration or sympathy. He refused to allow Poppaea's body to be cremated according to traditional Roman custom. Instead, he ordered it embalmed using techniques borrowed from Egyptian burial practices, then placed in a tomb more elaborate than those reserved for previous emperors. He declared her a goddess, established an official cult in her honor, and spent entire days talking to her corpse, as if she could still hear and respond to his words. The imperial court found itself navigating an even more treacherous landscape than before. Courtiers were expected to participate in the elaborate fiction that Poppaea somehow remained alive. They had to refer to her in the present tense during conversations, leave her favorite seat empty at state banquets, and pretend that her divine spirit was actively participating in the daily business of running the empire. Anyone who dared suggest that the emperor should accept reality and move forward with his life found themselves immediately exiled to distant provinces or worse. It was during this period of imperial madness that a young man named Sporus first caught Nero's attention. Though he had absolutely no idea, he was about to walk into a nightmare beyond human comprehension. Sporus was probably around 14 or 15 years old, born into slavery within the imperial household, but freed as a child, a common practice that was meant to inspire loyalty through gratitude. He had been raised within the palace walls, receiving an education that prepared him for administrative duties in the vast bureaucracy that kept the empire functioning. This was actually a position of considerable privilege by the standards of the time. Freedmen in imperial service often enjoyed better living conditions and more opportunities than freeborn citizens from lower social classes. But this privilege came with a terrible price: complete dependence on imperial favor and absolute vulnerability to the whims of their former master. Freedmen owed everything to the emperor's generosity, which created a relationship of total submission. They could be elevated to positions of great influence and wealth, but they could also be discarded, punished, or killed on a moment's notice, with no legal recourse whatsoever. Their entire existence depended on maintaining the emperor's approval, making them perfect victims for someone with Nero's twisted psychology. What made Sporus special in Nero's eyes had nothing to do with his intelligence, his skills, or his potential for loyal service. It was simply his face. Multiple ancient sources agree that the young man bore an uncanny resemblance to the dead Poppaea, particularly around the eyes and in the delicate structure of his facial bones. In a world where Romans believed that physical resemblance indicated deeper spiritual connections, this similarity would have seemed almost supernatural to the grieving emperor. The first time Nero encountered Sporus after Poppaea's death, something clicked in his broken mind. Here, he believed, was a chance to undo the irreversible, to somehow bring back what his own violence had destroyed. The resemblance was so striking that for a moment, Nero may have actually convinced himself that he was seeing Poppaea's spirit return to him in a new form, a gift from the gods to compensate for his loss. Of course, there was one obvious and insurmountable problem with this fantasy. Sporus was male. His body, his voice, his entire physical being proclaimed a masculine identity that completely contradicted Nero's desperate vision of resurrection and reunion. But for a man who had convinced himself that he was a living god, who had spent months conducting conversations with a corpse, the challenge of changing someone's gender seemed like a relatively minor obstacle. What happened next represents one of the most calculated and systematic acts of cruelty in recorded human history. Nero didn't simply decide to force Sporus to dress in women's clothing and play a feminine role during private moments. He made the decision to transform the young man permanently and completely, to destroy every trace of his original identity and remake him as a living replacement for his murdered wife. The emperor summoned the most skilled physicians in Rome and ordered them to perform surgery on Sporus, procedures designed solely to make him appear more feminine. This wasn't medical treatment for any genuine condition. It was deliberate mutilation carried out for the psychological satisfaction of a madman. The surgery was dangerous, excruciatingly painful, and completely irreversible. Many patients died from infection or blood loss, but even those who survived were forever changed in ways that went far beyond the physical. Ancient surgical procedures were primitive by any modern standard, relying on basic metal instruments and crude forms of anesthesia that provided minimal relief from agony. The process would have lasted for hours with Sporus, held down by Imperial guards, while physicians approached him with their knives, knowing that his screams would fall on deaf ears and that no one in the Empire had the power to intervene on his behalf. The psychological trauma of this experience is almost impossible to comprehend. Imagine being a teenage boy, suddenly seized by the most powerful man in the world and subjected to procedures that would permanently alter your body, your identity, your entire future. Every aspect of who you were and who you might have become was being systematically destroyed to satisfy one man's twisted fantasy of resurrection and control. Once Sporus had recovered from the surgery, a process that could take weeks or months, Nero announced something that shocked even the jaded aristocrats of Rome, who thought they had already witnessed every possible form of imperial excess. He was going to marry the young man in a full imperial wedding ceremony, complete with all the traditional rituals and legal formalities that would make this union officially recognized throughout the empire. The preparations consumed months and drained enormous resources from the imperial treasury. Sporus was given a new name, Sabina, deliberately chosen to echo the name of Nero's dead wife. He was moved to special quarters within the palace complex, where teams of servants could begin the elaborate process of preparing him for his new role as Empress of Rome. Imperial seamstresses worked around the clock to create an entire wardrobe for him, designing gowns and robes that would flatter his surgically altered physique while concealing any remaining traces of masculine characteristics. Master jewelers crafted ornaments specifically for his use, many incorporating precious gems that had once belonged to Poppaea herself. These weren't simply accessories or decorations. They were tangible links to the dead woman, physical reminders of the person Sporus was being forced to replace in Nero's delusional fantasy. Makeup artists were brought in to teach him the intricate cosmetic techniques required to feminize his features. They showed him how to use kohl to make his eyes appear larger and more expressive, how to apply rouge to create the illusion of naturally rosy cheeks, and how to use various powders and pigments to soften the angular lines of his face. These weren't simple beauty lessons. They were systematic exercises in erasing his original identity, replacing every trace of the boy he had been with a carefully constructed feminine facade. Hairdressers instructed him in the elaborate styling techniques that were fashionable among aristocratic Roman women. His hair was cut, curled, and arranged in complex patterns that required hours to complete, and often incorporated expensive ornaments made from gold, silver, and precious stones. The process was physically exhausting, requiring him to sit motionless for extended periods, while servants worked with heated metal tools that could easily burn his scalp if he moved at the wrong moment. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of his transformation was the training in feminine behavior and deportment. Sporus was assigned a team of tutors whose sole responsibility was teaching him how to walk, sit, and gesture in ways that would be considered appropriately ladylike by Roman standards. He had to learn how to hold his hands in delicate positions, how to position his feet when seated, how to arrange his clothing gracefully, and how to move through space in a way that conveyed feminine grace rather than masculine strength. Voice coaches worked with him daily to modify his speech patterns, teaching him to speak in higher tones and adopt the linguistic mannerisms associated with aristocratic women. This was perhaps the most challenging aspect of his transformation, as vocal patterns are deeply ingrained habits that resist conscious modification. Every word he spoke had to be carefully controlled, every inflection monitored and adjusted to maintain the illusion that Nero was so desperately trying to create. The psychological torture of this process is almost beyond imagination. Every morning, Sporus woke up and looked into mirrors that reflected back the face of a stranger wearing his features. Every lesson in feminine behavior served as a reminder that his original identity was being systematically dismantled and replaced. Every piece of jewelry that had once adorned a dead woman became a shackle binding him to a role he had never chosen and could never escape. The wedding ceremony was scheduled for the spring of 67 AD, deliberately timed to coincide with religious festivals that would lend additional ceremonial weight to the occasion. Nero spared absolutely no expense, treating this as a legitimate imperial wedding worthy of the greatest emperor in Roman history. The ceremony took place in the largest hall of the palace complex, decorated with thousands of imported flowers and illuminated by countless oil lamps that turned night into day. Professional musicians played traditional wedding songs, while servants offered the finest wines and most exotic delicacies that could be procured from across the empire. To casual observers who weren't aware of the full story, the event might have appeared to be a normal imperial wedding, complete with all the pomp and circumstance that such occasions demanded. But those who understood the true nature of what they were witnessing knew they were participating in something unprecedented and deeply disturbing. Here was the most powerful man in the known world publicly marrying a surgically modified teenage boy who had been dressed and trained to impersonate his murdered wife. The ceremony included all the traditional Roman wedding rituals. Vows were exchanged, hands were joined, sacred bread was shared, and legal documents were signed to make this union officially recognized throughout the empire. The assembled guests played their parts with the practiced skill of seasoned courtiers, offering congratulations and presenting expensive gifts while maintaining expressions of appropriate joy and celebration. But beneath the surface pageantry, the atmosphere must have been thick with barely concealed horror, morbid fascination, and the nervous energy that comes from witnessing something fundamentally wrong. Following the wedding ceremony, Nero treated Sporus exactly as he would have treated any legitimate empress. The young man received his own household staff, private quarters within the palace complex, and a substantial income drawn directly from the imperial treasury. He was provided with his own ornate litter for traveling through the city, fine horses for riding, and an entire retinue of supporters and attendants whose job was to maintain the elaborate fiction of his new identity. But all of this apparent luxury and privilege came with a terrible price. Sporus had to live with the complete erasure of his original self and the constant performance of a psychologically devastating role that could never be abandoned, even for a moment. He was expected to accompany Nero to all public functions, sitting beside him at state dinners and official ceremonies, playing the part of the devoted imperial wife in every interaction with foreign diplomats, Roman senators, and visiting dignitaries. This wasn't simply about maintaining appearances for the sake of political protocol. Nero genuinely seemed to believe that he had succeeded in bringing Poppaea back from the dead through sheer force of will and imperial authority. He would address Sporus using his dead wife's name, reminisce about shared memories that had never actually happened, and expect responses that maintained the elaborate fiction he had constructed in his fractured mind. For Sporus, every single day became a high-stakes performance, where the slightest mistake or momentary lapse could result in punishment or death. He had to remember not only how to look and act like a woman, but how to respond as if he were actually Poppaea herself, complete with intimate knowledge of events from Nero's previous marriage that he had never witnessed or experienced. Ancient sources describe Sporus as becoming increasingly skilled at this elaborate deception, developing an almost supernatural ability to anticipate Nero's moods and respond appropriately to his every demand. But they also note that he grew more withdrawn and melancholic as time passed, though he continued to play his assigned role flawlessly whenever he appeared in public. The psychological strain of this existence is almost impossible to fully comprehend. Every morning, Sporus awakened in rooms that had been decorated to remind him of a woman he had never met. Every reflection in every mirror showed him a face that bore no resemblance to his original appearance. Every conversation required him to pretend to be someone else entirely, complete with memories and experiences that belonged to another person who is now dead. For more than 2 years, Sporus lived this bizarre and nightmarish existence, trapped between life and death, between his original identity and the role that had been forced upon him. But his ordeal reached new heights of absurdity and degradation when Nero decided to embark on an extended tour of Greece, where the emperor fancied himself as a great artist and performer.